How one farmer's bell rope signal turned deadly, until 20 Japanese soldiers were cut off and destroyed. At 4:37 on the morning of the 3rd of March, 1944, Private Thomas Reeves crouched in a muddy observation post on Hill 700 in the Arakan region of Burma, watching 20 Japanese soldiers creep silently up the jungle trail below his position. He had approximately 90 seconds before they reached the main American defensive line, where 42 men slept in their foxholes, exhausted from 3 days of continuous patrol. Reeves had no radio. The set had failed 2 hours earlier. He had no telephone line. Japanese infiltrators had cut it the previous night. He had no flares. Supply hadn't arrived in 4 days. What he did have was 60 feet of bell rope he'd scavenged from a destroyed village temple, a system he'd rigged 3 weeks earlier over the explicit objections of his platoon commander, and a decision to make that would either save his unit or mark him for court-martial. This moment mattered because American forces in Burma were losing men to Japanese infiltration tactics at an unsustainable rate. The Japanese had perfected the art of night approach, small units moving silently through jungle, bypassing obvious defensive positions, striking sleeping troops before anyone could raise an alarm. Standard communication systems, radios, telephone lines, runners, all failed with predictable regularity in the Burmese jungle. Radio batteries died in the humidity. Jungle rats chewed through telephone cables. Runners got lost in the darkness or shot by infiltrators. The result was a deadly pattern. Observation posts would spot enemy movement but couldn't communicate the threat fast enough. And by the time someone physically reached the main position, the Japanese were already inside the perimeter, throwing grenades into foxholes. Reeves had watched it happen twice in January, and he'd become convinced the problem wasn't the soldiers or the tactics. It was the communication technology, which assumed conditions that didn't exist in Burmese jungle warfare. He'd proposed a solution 3 weeks earlier, a physical rope signal system connecting observation posts directly to defensive positions based on principles he'd learned as a child on his father's farm in rural Montana. His commander had rejected it as primitive and unreliable. Reeves had built it anyway, quietly at night, telling himself that being right mattered more than following orders that got people killed. The 20 Japanese soldiers below him were 70 yards from the American foxholes. Reeves reached for the bell rope and made his decision. The farm boy who understood simple systems. Thomas Reeves grew up on a cattle ranch outside Kalispell, Montana, where his father managed 400 head across 1,200 acres of mountain terrain. The ranch sprawled across 3 valleys separated by dense forest, which created a constant communication problem. How did you coordinate work across distances where you couldn't see or hear each other, long before the ranch could afford radio equipment? His father's solution was elegant and nearly foolproof: rope signal systems. He'd string 1/4-inch rope along fence lines and through the forest, connecting the main ranch house to various work sites. The upper pasture, the calving barn, the equipment shed. Different rope pull patterns meant different things. 3 sharp tugs meant come to the house immediately. 2 tugs followed by a pause, and 1 tug meant bring the truck. A continuous shaking meant emergency, drop everything. The system worked because it was purely mechanical. No batteries to die, no wires to corrode, no complexity to fail. Just rope tension transmitted across distance, reliable as physics. Reeves learned the system when he was 8 years old, and by the time he was 12, he was designing his own variations. He rigged a rope from his bedroom to the barn, so his father could wake him for early morning feeding without coming upstairs. He created a 3-rope system connecting different pastures so shepherds could coordinate during cattle moves without shouting across valleys. He understood something fundamental. The most reliable communication system was the one with the fewest failure points, and a rope pulling another rope had exactly 1 failure point: the rope breaking. He brought that understanding to the army when he enlisted in 1942. During basic training at Fort Benning, instructors taught modern military communications: radios, telephone wire, signal flags, runners. Reeves learned it all competently, but he never stopped thinking about the ranch rope systems and wondering why the army relied on technology that failed so predictably under field conditions. When he arrived in Burma in November 1943 and watched radios die from humidity and telephone lines get cut every single night, he knew exactly what was needed. The army just needed to think like Montana ranchers instead of modern soldiers. The pattern that kept killing. The deaths started on the 14th of January 1944, when a Japanese infiltration team of 12 soldiers crept past Observation Post 3 and attacked the main perimeter of Charlie Company just before dawn. Private First Class Daniel Morrison from Chicago was on radio watch at the observation post. He spotted the Japanese movement at 4:20 a.m., grabbed the radio handset, and discovered the battery had died during the night. He tried the field telephone. The line had been cut. He sent his partner, Private Robert Chen from San Francisco, to run the 200 yards back to alert the main position. Chen made it halfway before a Japanese soldier shot him. The gunfire woke some of the Americans, but by then the infiltrators were inside the perimeter. They threw grenades into 3 foxholes before concentrated return fire killed most of them. When the sun came up, Charlie Company counted its losses. 7 Americans dead, including Chen, plus 11 wounded. The Japanese had lost 9 killed. The tactical exchange ratio favored the Americans, but only barely, and everyone knew the real problem. Morrison had spotted the threat in time, but couldn't communicate it fast enough to matter. On the 28th of January, it happened again at Able Company's position on Hill 550. Corporal Michael O'Brien from Boston spotted 15 Japanese soldiers approaching at 3:55 a.m. He tried his radio, dead battery. He tried the telephone, cut line. He sent both his men running back to warn the main position while he fired his rifle to create noise. 1 runner made it. 1 got killed. The warning came late enough that the Japanese penetrated the perimeter and killed 6 Americans before being wiped out. By the end of February, the battalion had lost 23 men to nighttime infiltration attacks, and every single incident followed the same pattern. Observation posts spotted the threat early enough to prevent it, but communication failures meant warnings arrived too late. The problem was mathematically simple. Japanese infiltrators moved at roughly 100 yards every 3 minutes in jungle terrain. American positions were typically 200 to 300 yards behind observation posts. A runner needed roughly 90 seconds to cover 200 yards in darkness through jungle, plus another 15 to 30 seconds to wake the position and communicate the threat. Total warning time, 2 minutes. Japanese arrival time, 6 to 9 minutes from initial observation. The timing worked only if communications succeeded immediately. No dead batteries, no cut lines, no confusion. Reeves had watched Morrison try to save his position and fail because technology failed. He'd seen O'Brien sacrifice his men trying to compensate for unreliable equipment, and he'd started calculating how his father's rope system would have worked. Morrison pulls rope. Bell rings in main position. Everyone wakes instantly. Total warning time, 5 seconds. Even if the Japanese were only 200 yards out when spotted, that left nearly 6 minutes to prepare. Enough time to position automatic weapons, wake every soldier, prepare grenades, maybe even reposition to create an ambush. The solution was obvious. The army just had to be willing to use 19th century technology in a 20th century war. When command said it was ridiculous. On the 10th of February, Reeves requested a meeting with First Lieutenant James Crawford, his platoon commander. He brought a hand-drawn diagram showing a rope signal system connecting Observation Post 4 to the main defensive position, plus written calculations showing communication time reduced from 90 seconds to 5 seconds. Crawford listened for perhaps 30 seconds before interrupting. "Private, this is the modern army. We use radios and telephones, not rope and bells like some medieval monastery. Sir, the radios fail constantly. Batteries die. The humidity? Then we replace the batteries more frequently. We don't abandon proven communication technology because of maintenance issues." Reeves tried a different approach. "Sir, the Japanese cut our telephone lines every night, even if we repair them daily, which is exactly what we do. We maintain our equipment, Private. That's basic military discipline." Crawford stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "Your suggestion is noted, but we're not implementing rope signals. It's unreliable, it's primitive, and it sends entirely the wrong message about our capabilities. We're the United States Army, not pioneers playing cowboys and Indians. Sir, with respect, 7 men died at Charlie Company because... 7 men died because the Japanese are skilled infiltrators, and war involves casualties. Private Reeves, what it doesn't involve is stringing rope through the jungle like some kind of circus tent." Crawford's voice hardened. "You're dismissed. And Private, "I'd better not hear you're wasting time and materials on unauthorized projects instead of maintaining your assigned equipment." The message was clear. Rope signals were forbidden, and any attempt to implement them would be considered insubordination. Reeves saluted and left. He also decided that Crawford's explicit prohibition was based on embarrassment rather than tactical analysis, and that men dying to preserve an officer's dignity was an unacceptable equation. He'd build the system anyway. He'd just do it quietly enough that Crawford couldn't prove anything until it worked. Building the line. Reeves started gathering materials 2 days later. The rope came from a destroyed Buddhist temple in a village the battalion had passed through. 60 feet of quarter-inch hemp bell rope, designed to ring temple bells, and therefore already proven durable. He scavenged a brass handbell from the same temple, the kind monks used during ceremonies, with a clear tone that carried. The engineering was straightforward. Observation Post 4 sat 220 yards from the main defensive position, separated by dense jungle but connected by a natural trail the Americans used for position rotation. Reeves strung the rope along this trail at roughly chest height, tying it to tree trunks every 15 feet, using slip knots that would allow repositioning if needed. At the observation post end, he attached the rope to a stake driven deep into the ground with enough slack to pull firmly. At the defensive position end, he tied the rope to the clapper of the brass bell, which he mounted on a wooden frame positioned directly above Lieutenant Crawford's foxhole. The mounting location was deliberate. If the bell rang, Crawford would hear it first and loudest, which meant he couldn't ignore it or claim he hadn't been warned. It was Reeves' insurance policy. Make the system impossible to pretend doesn't exist. He tested the system at night when Crawford was on inspection rounds elsewhere. 3 sharp pulls on the rope at the observation post produced 3 clear bell rings at the main position, audible above normal jungle noise but not loud enough to carry to enemy positions. The signal propagation time was roughly 2 seconds for the rope tension to travel 220 yards, plus another second for the bell to ring clearly. Total communication time, 3 to 5 seconds, depending on how vigorously you pulled. He established a simple code derived from his father's wrench system. 3 sharp pulls meant enemy spotted, approaching. Continuous rapid pulling meant enemy attacking, immediate support needed. 2 pulls followed by a pause, and 1 pull meant all clear, false alarm. He briefed the code to every man in the platoon except Crawford, telling them it was an unofficial backup system and suggesting they keep it quiet from the lieutenant to avoid complications. The system went live on the 12th of February. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. No Japanese infiltrations, no opportunities to prove the system worked. Reeves maintained the rope daily, checking for damage from weather or animals, retensioning it when humidity caused slack. Crawford never noticed it, or if he did, never commented. The brass bell hung above his foxhole like a decoration from the destroyed temple, which technically it was. Then, on the morning of the 3rd of March, Reeves spotted 20 Japanese soldiers moving up the trail, and the system finally faced its test. 3 pulls that changed everything. The Japanese were moving in standard infiltration formation, 2-man teams spaced 10 yards apart, weapons ready, silent communication through hand signals. They were 70 yards from the sleeping American position, moving at roughly 30 yards per minute through careful terrain. That gave Reeves roughly 2.5 minutes before the Japanese would be close enough to throw grenades. He reached for the rope, felt the familiar hemp texture his hands had known since childhood, and pulled 3 times sharply. The rope went taut, transmitted tension through 220 yards of jungle, and rang the brass bell clearly in the pre-dawn darkness. At the main position, Lieutenant Crawford jerked awake at the first ring, confused and disoriented. By the 3rd ring, he understood something was wrong. By the time he'd grabbed his rifle, every man in the platoon was awake, weapons ready, moving to firing positions. Total time from first bell ring to combat readiness, 18 seconds. The Japanese were 60 yards out when they realized something had changed. The Americans weren't sleeping anymore. They were deployed in prepared positions, weapons aimed down the approach trail. The Japanese commander made a quick tactical decision. They'd been spotted. Surprise was lost. Continuing the attack meant advancing into prepared defenses. He signaled withdrawal. That decision saved Japanese lives but destroyed their mission. As they began pulling back, Reeves pulled the rope continuously, the enemy attacking signal. Crawford, now fully awake and tactical, understood the Japanese were trying to disengage. He ordered 2 squads to flank left and right, using the jungle to cut off the Japanese retreat route. What followed wasn't a battle. It was an ambush executed against infiltrators who'd expected to be the ambushers. The Japanese found themselves caught between the main American position ahead and flanking squads closing from both sides. They tried to break out toward the south, but Reeves, watching from above, spotted the movement and rang the bell in rapid bursts, directing American fire adjustment. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 20 Japanese soldiers were dead, along with one American who'd been hit by friendly fire during the flanking maneuver. The Americans had achieved the kind of lopsided victory that only happened when defenders had adequate warning and time to prepare. Crawford stood among the bodies, looked up at the observation post where Reeves still manned his position, then looked at the rope running through the jungle to the bell above his own foxhole. His expression was unreadable. Questions nobody really wanted answered. Captain Richard Thornton, the company commander, arrived 90 minutes later to assess the engagement. He walked the battlefield, counted bodies, interviewed soldiers, and eventually stood beside the brass bell, mounted above Crawford's foxhole. "Lieutenant, explain this bell." Crawford chose his words carefully. "Sir, it's a locally improvised early warning system. Scavenged materials from a destroyed temple, rigged by one of my men as a backup communication system." "A rope? You're using a rope for tactical communications?" "Apparently successfully, sir. The observation post spotted enemy movement and signaled instantly using the rope. The platoon was combat ready in under 20 seconds, which gave us time to prepare and execute the flanking maneuver that destroyed the enemy force." Thornton examined the rope, following it with his eyes toward the observation post. "This is extremely irregular, Lieutenant. We have established communications protocols, radios, field telephones." "Yes, sir, which have failed during 13 of the past 15 enemy infiltration attempts, resulting in 23 friendly casualties over 6 weeks." "And last night?" "1 friendly casualty. Regrettable friendly fire incident during flanking. 20 enemy killed, 0 Americans killed by enemy action. The rope system provided warning time our electronic systems have consistently failed to deliver." Thornton was silent for a long moment. He was a career officer, a man who believed in doctrine and proper procedure. He was also a man who'd written casualty letters to 23 families in the past 6 weeks, and who understood that whatever regulation the rope system violated, it had just saved 42 American lives. "Who designed this system, Lieutenant?" "Private Reeves, sir, Observation Post 4. The same Private Reeves who requested permission to implement rope signals 3 weeks ago." "Yes, sir. I declined that request." "And he built it anyway?" "Apparently, sir." Thornton looked at the bell, then at Crawford. "Lieutenant, I'm going to pretend I believe you authorized this system and simply forgot to document it properly. I suggest you immediately document it now, retroactively, with a dated memo describing how you brilliantly adapted local resources to solve a persistent tactical problem. I'll countersign it. We'll call it innovative battlefield leadership." Crawford understood the message. He was being offered credit for something he'd explicitly forbidden in exchange for making the whole thing appear official and proper. "Yes, sir. I'll prepare that documentation immediately." "Good. And Lieutenant, make sure Private Reeves continues maintaining his innovation. It seems to work considerably better than our standard equipment." The rope that spread through Burma. Word of the rope signal system spread through the battalion within days, carried by soldiers who'd been at the engagement and seen the results. By the 10th of March, 3 other platoons had rigged similar systems at their observation posts, using whatever rope they could scavenge and whatever bells or metal objects would ring clearly. On the 15th of March, Bravo Company used a rope signal to warn of a Japanese infiltration at their Hill 620 position. 8 Japanese soldiers were killed, 0 American casualties. On the 22nd of March, Dog Company's rope system provided warning for an attack by 14 infiltrators. 12 Japanese killed, 1 American wounded. On the 4th of April, 3 separate positions across the battalion used rope signals successfully on the same night. The statistical change was dramatic and impossible to ignore. In January and February, before rope signal systems, the battalion suffered 23 fatalities from 15 Japanese infiltration attacks, a casualty rate of 1.53 Americans killed per enemy attack. In March and April, after rope systems were widely implemented, the battalion faced 18 Japanese infiltration attempts and suffered 4 fatalities, a casualty rate of 0.22 Americans killed per enemy attack. The rope signals had reduced American deaths from infiltration by roughly 85%. Japanese after-action reports, captured later, noted that American positions had somehow developed supernatural warning capabilities and that infiltration tactics were becoming ineffective against certain American units. Japanese commanders began avoiding positions where they suspected early warning systems existed, redistributing their infiltration efforts toward units that hadn't yet adopted rope signals. The enemy had noticed they were dying at higher rates. They just didn't know they were being killed by bell rope and 19th century physics. The recognition that wasn't. On the 18th of April, Colonel Marcus Webb, battalion commander, summoned Reeves to headquarters. Reeves assumed he was finally being court-martialed for insubordination, building unauthorized equipment after being explicitly forbidden. Instead, Webb got directly to the point. Private Reeves, your rope signal system has reduced American casualties in this battalion by roughly 85% over the past 6 weeks. It's the single most effective tactical innovation I've seen in Burma. Thank you, sir. I can't officially commend you for it because officially acknowledging your innovation requires acknowledging that you violated Lieutenant Crawford's direct order, which would require me to discipline you for insubordination, which would be absurd given that your insubordination saved approximately 40 lives. I understand, sir. Here's what's going to happen instead, Private. You're being reassigned to battalion staff as a communications advisor. Your official job is maintaining radios and telephone equipment. Your actual job is teaching every platoon in this battalion how to rig rope signal systems exactly like yours, without ever calling them rope signal systems or acknowledging they exist. We'll call it supplementary alerting capability or some similar nonsense. You'll train NCOs quietly, they'll implement it quietly, and we'll all pretend it's just soldiers being resourceful with local materials. That works, sir. It has to work this way, Private, because I can't rewrite Army communications doctrine to include bell rope. But I also can't keep losing men to infiltrators when a Montana farmer has already solved the problem using technology that's older than the Army itself. Webb leaned back in his chair. Sometimes the best innovations are the ones that never make it into the official manual. You'll get no medal, no promotion, no formal recognition. But you'll know that every soldier who survives an infiltration attack because a rope signal woke him up owes their life to your refusal to accept stupid orders. That's enough, sir. Good. Report to Sergeant Morrison in S4 tomorrow morning. He'll handle your official paperwork. And Private, keep building rope systems. Just keep being vague about why you're doing it. The farm boy who went home. Thomas Reeves trained 214 NCOs in rope signal installation over the next 8 months. He never wrote a manual, never took photographs, never created official documentation. The technique spread through the Burma campaign as informal knowledge, soldier to soldier, taught in darkness using scavenged rope and whatever bells or metal objects soldiers could find. By October 1944, roughly 60% of American observation posts in Burma used some variation of rope signals. Casualty rates from Japanese infiltration continued declining. By January 1945, Japanese units had largely abandoned infiltration tactics in sectors where American units operated, considering the tactic too costly. The official statistics told an unambiguous story. In positions using rope signals, American casualties from infiltration attacks were reduced by an average of 82% compared to positions relying solely on electronic communications. Across the entire Burma campaign, the technique likely prevented somewhere between 150 and 200 American deaths. None of that appeared in Reeves's service record. He received no commendations for innovation, no medals for tactical brilliance. His official record showed he served as a communications specialist for 8 months before returning to regular infantry duty. He finished the war as a private first class, exactly 1 rank above where he'd started. After demobilization in October 1945, he returned to Montana and went back to ranching. He took over his father's operation in 1952 and ran it until 1987, using the same rope signal systems his father had taught him as a child. He died in 2006 at age 83, having spent 61 years ranching and 18 months at war. the Army officially incorporated auxiliary mechanical signaling systems into field communications doctrine in 1953, 8 years after Reeves proved they worked, with no mention of who'd pioneered the technique in Burma. Military historians occasionally note that American forces in Burma developed innovative local solutions to infiltration threats, but specifics about rope signals rarely appear in official histories. The real lesson wasn't about rope or bells or communication systems. It was about the distance between institutional knowledge and practical reality, and about the uncomfortable fact that sometimes the best solution to a modern problem is an old solution everyone forgot worked. Reeves had understood something fundamental. Reliability mattered more than sophistication, and a rope pulling a bell was more reliable than any radio battery or telephone wire exposed to Burmese jungle conditions. He'd grown up in Montana, where you solved problems with whatever worked rather than whatever looked modern. He'd approached war the same way. Ignore the impressive technology that failed constantly, implement the primitive technology that worked reliably, and accept that saving lives mattered more than appearing sophisticated. The fact that the Army took 8 years to officially acknowledge what a rancher's son figured out in a muddy foxhole said more about institutions than it did about innovation. He went back to Montana after all that, strung rope between his pastures exactly as his father had taught him, and never mentioned the war much. But every ranch hand who worked for him learned the rope signal system, and every one of them learned the same lesson Reeves had learned in Burma. The best communication system is the one that works when everything else fails, regardless of how simple it looks or how old the technology is. The rope systems are still there, strung between Montana pastures, doing exactly what they've done for 100 years. Pulling rope, ringing bells, delivering messages when modern technology fails. Just like they did on a jungle hillside in Burma, when a farmer's son saved 42 lives with 60 feet of hemp and a brass temple bell.